And it is 10 now, so good morning, everyone. We're about to get started with Rabbi David Silber's share on the Sefer Shemot. Um, thank you for joining us again. As usual, I'm inviting everyone to be a panelist. That way you can unmute, ask any questions when we pause for them. I will be keeping an eye on the chat here, so if you have any questions in the intervening time, I can make sure that they get to Rabbi Silber. Um, okay.
Right then, very good. A lot of work ahead. Let's begin. So we're towards the end of the fourth chapter, and we started. We haven't fully completed the story. When Moshe finally agrees to go back to Mitzrayim, and God then speaks to Moshe again as he's about to go down, and God assures him, "You can go down to Egypt. All the people that seek your life, they've all died. But then, surprisingly, it turns out perhaps that all the people that seek Moshe's life have died. However, in verse number 24, Pasuk Kaf Daled, chapter 4, Vahiba derech b'malon, that on the way down on the path, b'malon, an inn, a place where one sleeps, Vayifkesheu Hashem vayivakesh hamito, that God encountered him and sought to kill him. Rather remarkable. In other words, in retrospect, God had said, all the people that want to kill you, they're gone. But that excludes only the people that want to kill Moshe. What about Hashem? Vayifkesheu Hashem vayivakesh hamito. Now, obviously, if God actually wanted to kill Moshe, he would be dead. So clearly, God doesn't really want to kill him. Seeks to kill him means that something must be done to prevent Moshe's death. And in this instance, surprisingly, it's not Moshe who does anything, but rather his wife, Tzipora. Vatikach Tzipora tzor, vatichrot et orlat bena, vatagar raglav, vatomer ki chatan damim matali, vayiraf mimenu, azamra chatan damim lamulot. As I mentioned last week, one of the more enigmatic stories of the Bible would appear that actually, so Hashem seeks to kill Moshe, and Moshe seems to be saved. The simplest reading of the text is that Tzipora circumcises, says her son, Binah, and touches the blood, l'raglav. So the question is, whose regel is it referring to? I assumed it was Moshe's regel, and she says, you are a chatan damim, a bloody bridegroom. Vayiref mimen, when he, referring to Hashem, I presume, departs. Azamra, then she said, chatan damim lamulot. To say this is enigmatic would be an understatement. So we discussed last week, first of all, why does God seek to kill Moshe? And we raised two possibilities. One is found in the Rashbam, that fundamentally it's a function of Moshe's unwillingness, says the Rashbam, his obstinacy in terms of taking on the mission. Moshe finally, after all the arguments, said, send somebody else. No, he finally agrees to go, send Aaron with you. That anger requires some kind of expiation. And the Rashbam explains that the blood of the circumcision, says the Rashbam, is like the blood of a sacrifice, an atoning sacrifice. That's the Rashbam. I don't find that fully satisfactory, to tell you the truth, because suddenly you have the circumcision mentioned over here, not the sacrifice. It is true that in our tradition, circumcision and sacrifice there's a relationship between them. Maybe we'll talk about that in the future. But I think the better interpretation seems to be that somehow it's related to the circumcision itself. And that is that for whatever reason, Moshe has failed to circumcise his son. And that here the circumcision is done by Tzipora, and it's very striking, but Tichrot et Orlat, it doesn't say Orlat Beno, his son. It says Orlat Bena, her son. And that suggests to me that what's the point of the story is that Moshe, who unwillingly has taken on the responsibility to save Bnei Israel, He's thinking in terms of himself and Bnei Yisrael, but he's not thinking in terms of the next generation. And the point over here is that his own being and the being of his descendant, in this case his son, are bound together. And that actually fits in very well in the story, because prior to that, God had told Moshe, when you get back to Egypt, tell Paro, back in verse number 22, V'amarta el Paro, kol amar Hashem, b'ni b'chori Yisrael, Israel is my firstborn son, my firstborn child. V'amare lecha, so I say to you, to Paro, shalachet b'ni v'yavdeni, send my son to serve me, v'atim ma'en l'shalcho, and you refuse to do it. I will kill your firstborn son. So you see already in the Psukim 22 and 23 the identification of the father with the son. Israel is my eldest son. If you refuse to permit my eldest son to serve me, I'm going to kill your eldest son. And the very next story is about a father and his son. It strikes me that therefore the key to the story over here is about the relationship of parent and child. And what I suggested last week is that the touching of the blood to the foot, one might say to the side, reminds us of the Korban Pesach. Because the Korban Pesach, you bring the sacrifice, you bring the blood, you put the blood of the sacrifice on the lintel and on the doorpost. And there the Torah says that God says, I will pass through Egypt on that night. I will smite all the firstborn of Egypt. Right? But as far as you are concerned, the avenging, the destroying angel will see the blood on the doorposts. Will not allow the Pasach Hashem ala Pesach. God will hover above the house. Pasach probably means to hover above, and not permit the destroying angel to enter the house. So when the destroying angel doesn't enter the house is safe. In other words, the point is that the house is saved, one might say, on account of the fact that God is sparing the firstborn son. So the emphasis is on the house, not just the son, but there's also an emphasis on the son. So it strikes me that the idea of the Korban Pesach is the identification of the children together with the parents. And the way I tried to frame that, to explain that, is to point out that the story of the Exodus is a fulfillment of a prior covenantal promise. The promise made to Abraham, the covenant of the pieces, the Brit Ben Habitarim, that the fourth generation shall return to the land. There are 3 generations of suffering. And in the story of Mitzrayim, Sefer Shemot, that we've been engaged with, so when you look at the persecution of the Jews in Egypt, which begins after the death of Joseph and the death of his brothers, and a new Pharaoh emerges, the Melech Chadash Mitzrayim emerges, that if you count out the generations after the death of Joseph and his brothers, Moshe is the 3rd generation. Kahat, Amram, and Moshe. So Moshe is the 3rd generation, but the Chumash has told us earlier that Dor Revi'i Yashuvu Heina, the 4th generation, shall return. So therefore, it's incumbent upon Moshe not just to take out his generation from Egypt, but to set up the possibility that the next generation will in fact possess the land. It's absolutely essential. Otherwise, you can't fulfill the covenant. So the connection between parents and children, between generation 3 and generation 4, is central to this covenant. And therefore, since Moshe seems to have neglected in his thinking, by virtue of the fact that he did not circumcise his own child, and in fact, there are even on Midrashim, the Ramban quotes a medrash which he doesn't like, that Moshe said to Tzipora, the first kid can be yours, the second one can be mine. The first one can do Avodah Zarah. Ramban doesn't like that medrash for obvious reasons, but it does exist. And the fact of the matter is that I do think it's what's functioning in the story. The lesson that has to be learned over here, God is teaching Moshe about his mission even as he's headed down to Mitzrayim. The relationship between the parent and the child, or in this case, God says, these are my children. B'ni b'chori Yisrael, that identification is central to Moshe's mission, because just taking them out of Egypt is not going to fulfill the mission. The ultimate mission is B'dar Revi'i Yashuvu Hena. As God said to Moshe, and we studied this back in chapter 3 and 4, I'm going to go down to Egypt and bring them into the land. Eretz Avad Chalav Udvash. That's what it says in chapter 3, chapter 4. So therefore, Moshe seems not to have fully understood this important point, and that's the point about the Milah over here, and Sipporah performs the Milah. I have two other points I'd like to make, but before I continue, are there any comments or questions about what I've said so far?
David, it's Sandra.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
The connection between the Bechor, the connection between the Bechor and the Bayit, does this hark back to the midwives? The reward for them. It seems that God is being very consistent. He's saying, "Save the Bechor, I build you the house," and
Right.
And Moshe may not actually see this, but intuitively, the guy's got so much on his head. I mean, God is giving him just an enormous task, which he's so reluctant to step into. So, of course, he doesn't see this, but God is pretty consistent. Whoever saves the Bechor gets the bayit, and
Right.
would you say that that's almost a presaging of what we're seeing now? Bechor and bayit, we saw it in the
Yeah, I would
midwife.
definitely say that. By Yaslehem Batim in the first chapter, I would say that the very first pasuk of the book, Ishu Beit Obal, where they came down to Mitzrayim, they had a bayit. In the course of the slavery, they lose the bayit. The midwives are those who somehow, through their fear of God, merit the bayit. And then Moshe's task will be to create a bayit. And the idea of the bayit is the inclusive structure. In the case of the Korban Pesach, which is why it's so essential, it's the third and fourth generation both. So I would say for sure that the story of the midwives, and especially the enigmatic, whenever you have an enigmatic word or a phrase or an idea, which seems so strange, or seems totally insignificant, that's where you find significance. So Vayaslehem Batim of chapter 1 is highly significant, especially given the fact that the very first pasuk is Ishu Beit Obal. So I would completely endorse that position. I think that's a very good point. Okay, anybody else for any other comments? I have two other points I'd like to make over here about the story.
Excuse me, where
Yes.
else does the word Malone come up? That seems to be an odd word.
Well, Malone is you have the word Malone. I'm not sure. I think it does come up elsewhere. I didn't check it, but the word Lolun or Lino, sleeping over, that you have many places.
Right.
In the case of Rivka and the Eved. So you have it often. You have that often. It's a place where one sleeps, where one rests. It's a resting place along the way. He stops on the path by Derech. By the way, there is an interesting observation that's found in our tradition that why didn't Moshe circumcise his son? Okay, maybe why didn't he do it? You know, he has plenty of time to do it. And one of the reasons given is that he is baderech. When you were traveling on the road, somehow the road has hardships, dangers, or whatever, and that exempts you from circumcision. So you have the same concept in the book of Yoshua, where surprisingly we're told that all the years in the desert they didn't circumcise their children, and there it says because they were baderech, so it picks up on that idea. So the Midrashim certainly pick up on baderech, but it doesn't explain why he didn't circumcise his child earlier. So I do think the failure to circumcise is what's critical over here. I did want to mention one other point about baderech, which is a good point, and that is that when you read the story over here, I'm just going to put it out there and we can think about it together for a couple of minutes. But the story I think that comes to mind immediately about somebody who is coming home, who is returning home, because this person has to come home, because the person has a responsibility to God to come home. In the case over here, Moshe has promised God that Moshe will fulfill his task. He will save Israel. There's a parallel story where somebody comes home after many years, who's also made a promise. He took a vow that I'm going to someday come back and I'm going to build your house. And that's the story of Yaakov in Sefer Bereshit, when Yaakov runs away from home and he goes to sleep by Yola and Sham. He goes to sleep and he has a dream. In the dream, he sees angels going up and down a staircase to heaven. And he takes a vow. If you take care of me, protect me, give me food, give me clothing and food, I will come back to this place and I will build the house of God. Okay, so 20 years later, God says to him, go back. Go back and fulfill your vow. So Yaakov returns. That's in chapter 32. And he comes back. He hears that Esav is coming towards him with 400 men. He's very frightened. He prepares himself for the encounter. He's worried that Esav may try to kill him and all he possesses. And he's there. He prays to God, and God doesn't seem to respond. And then he takes all his family, he crosses over the Yabok ford, the Yabok waters. And then, Yaakov's left alone, and suddenly somebody is wrestling with him until dawn. And there's somebody who is wrestling with him, which appears to be not just a regular person, because Yaakov says, I have seen God face to face and I have survived. But the intention of this somebody is to presumably to destroy Yaakov. Yaakov manages to survive the encounter. He's wounded, but not destroyed. He's able to cross over afterwards. But these two stories seem very, very similar. Someone returns home. Someone has to return home. Someone made a promise to God or accepted God's charge, comes back finally, and then before he can cross over to the destined place, someone tries to kill him. In our instance, Vayifkesheu Hashem Vayivakesh Amito. In the case of Yaakov, it's this mysterious Ish, Vayavek Ishimo Adalot Hashachar, and clearly there's a parallel, or some kind of connection at least, if not a parallel, between these two stories. So I just want to say that what I have suggested a few minutes ago, I think, is a possible explanation of the parallel between them. The point of the Yaakov story is that Yaakov has promised to come back. Yaakov has promised to return. Yaakov, in returning, is going to assume his place alongside his father and grandfather, Abraham and Yitzchak. He becomes covenantal. He gets the covenantal blessing. But to get the covenantal blessing, he has to cross over to the other side. But the problem is, the Chumash says, he can't cross over to the other side if he just remains Yaakov. Because Yaakov's track record, Yaakov's resume is not the greatest. It is, misleading his father, tricking his blind father, taking the blessing that was destined for his brother or seems to be destined for his brother. It's manipulating Lavan's flocks. It's his total passivity in the face of all that goes on in the house of Lavan, etc., etc. So the Chumash is saying that, okay, he's going to come back to fulfill his mission, but he can't fulfill the mission if he doesn't understand fully what the mission is. If he doesn't understand his relationship to Lavan, to Esav, and to the covenant. So therefore, he has to be transformed. In that particular case, it's Yaakov who transforms himself. It's Yaakov's struggle. God provides the opportunity by sending the Ish, but it's Yaakov who self-transforms. He becomes a different person, and then he crosses over. So I would say something along those lines over here. There's something about Moshe who has grudgingly accepted the mission, but doesn't actually understand the mission. The mission is not just taking them out of Egypt. The mission is building a nation, and the focus can't be just the present-day slaves. The focus has to be the next generation, which we, the reader, know. Only the fourth generation shall return to the land. So the parallel between the two of them, actually, I think, is rather striking. And furthermore, there's another interesting parallel between the two of them. Something to think about. I don't want to get into this now, but something to think about. I'm sure this is right, though to explain it fully is not so simple. But in the case of Yaakov, he is actually wounded. He's wounded in the thigh, and in the gid, the sinew of the sinew of the thigh, the gid hanosher. So you have Yerech Yaakov in the story of Yaakov with the gid hanosher wrestling with the angel, and you have circumcision over here with Moshe. Now the thigh is often a euphemism, right? Because, for example, Yaakov's children, we have this in the very beginning of Sefer Shemot. Yaakov's family is 70. How does the Torah describe Yaakov's family? Vayhi Yotzei Yerech Yaakov Shivim Nafesh, right? Verse number 5 of this book that we're studying. all those Yotzei Yerech Yaakov, literally who descended from from Jacob's thigh. So his kids are called Yotzei Yerecho. So Yerecho probably is not a thigh, okay? And therefore, it's strikingly similar to what you have over here in the case of Mila. So I just point that out, that the two stories have that in common. And I made a suggestion as to what the commonality is. It's understanding who one is, one's mission is, etc. That I think is common to the two stories. In any event, there's a lot to think about here. We'll have to move on, but this is without question one of the more enigmatic stories. Obviously, if God truly sought to kill Moshe, he wouldn't survive. So it's more of an educational message over here. Understand who you are, what you are. It is interesting that the circumcision is Orlat Binah. She circumcised her son. And you have this later also in Sefer Shemot, when Yitro comes to Moshe in chapter 18. He wants to reunite with his beloved Moshe. And he says he brought with him Sipporah, Moshe's wife, V'yet Shnei Baneha, and her two children. One is named Gershon and one is named Eliezer. And it describes Moshe's children as Shtei Baneha, as her children. So it's actually very interesting in terms of Moshe's personal life. To what degree does Moshe's children, either his biological children, but to what extent are Moshe's children actually his heirs? It would not appear from the Chumash that Moshe's children in any manner, shape, or form are Moshe's heirs. Moshe's heir is not Moshe's child. Moshe's heir in the Chumash and in our tradition is Moshe's pupil. Yoshua ben Nun is Moshe's heir. That's clear. And the kids don't factor at all in the Chumash. The Midrashim are bothered by it. You can be bothered all you want. But the fact of the matter is, in the Chumash, they don't amount to anything. And in fact, they're simply non-existent. In the Tanakh, it's much worse than that, because Moshe's son Gershom, right, his grandson is apparently the Levi who was in charge of Pesel Micha and really introduces idolatry into the land in the most significant way. It's rather shocking. But you have that in the story of Pesel Micha, which is in the book of Shoftim, chapter 17, chapter 18. That's the Levi. It's a very interesting story, and it's very much connected to our story over here, but we can't get into that now. In any event, maybe someday we'll study Shoftim. Haven't taught that in a while. It's terrifically interesting. In any event, I think that's what I have to say about this story. I'll stop here for comments or questions or whatever. Anybody has something to add to this story, then we'll just continue afterwards in verse number 27. If there are comments or questions.
Do you want to say anything about the role of Tzipporah? She's a very enigmatic personality throughout, later on with Isha Kushit and that whole story.
Well, yes, I would say this. There's plenty to say about Tzipporah. I'll say two things about Tzipporah. There's a lot to say. First of all, let me just say that the fact that Moshe's life is saved by Tzipporah is a natural progression from what we've seen in the first 4 chapters of this book. This is one of those stories, and there aren't too many of them, but this is, I would say, with one other story, it's a story about women. Because that's how it begins. Paro says, listen, let's throw the boys into the Nile, but we'll keep the girls alive. Maybe he intends to take them. But in Paro's thinking, the danger comes from the boys. The boys we got to kill. For the girls, we just co-opt them, we'll take them or whatever. And the irony, of course, is that it's quite the opposite. The heroes of the story that make the Exodus possible, in the first chapter, it's the 2 midwives, Shifra and Pua. In chapter 2, it's this child's sister and the child's mother. And then it's Pharaoh's own daughter, actually, who keeps Moshe alive, who raises Moshe. And now we have finally Tzipporah, who saves his life. So you have a story from beginning to end where the women are, in fact, central. And it's part of, I think, the Paro thought the women are of no significance here, and quite the opposite is true, that without them, we don't have any kind of salvation. That's one thing that is for sure. The second thought I had was, I'm not going to get into the Isha Kushi, which is a whole other story, but it is interesting that her name is Tzipporah. Now, later on, when Yitro comes in chapter 18, he says he brought with him Tzipora after she was sent away. But the Tzipora is a bird. So I was thinking actually that if you think about what I mentioned till now about the third and fourth generation, that the third generation, 3 generations of suffering are represented in the covenantal story of chapter 15 of Breshit that we looked at many times. Moshe is told to take 3 animals, Eiz Mishuleshet, Ayu Mishuleshet, right? Ego Mishuleshet, to cut them in pieces. But then he takes 2 birds, right? Takes 2 birds. Bietat Tzipor lo batar. But the Tzipor he doesn't cut. The Tzipor represents the 4th generation, actually. Because the 4th generation is not in Egypt. The 4th generation doesn't suffer. So I find it interesting that in the story in which the 4th generation is being saved, that the one who saves the 4th generation is Mrs. Bird. I find that quite interesting, that her name is Tzipora in this context. I mean, it fits in very well. Is it a coincidence or is there something to it? I like to believe there's something to it. But again, it doesn't contradict the other point about the women's central role over here. And as far as the Isha Kushit, it doesn't, that's a whole other conversation. That's another story. All right, anyway. All right, let's pick up now in, again, we're up to chapter 4 in the 27th pasuk. Okay, let us begin. Vayomer Hashem el Aaron, Lech likrat Moshe hamidbara, Vayelech vayifkesheu bahar Elohim vayishaklo. So now we have God. This is unusual, by the way. It only appears, I think, 3 times in the Torah, where Vayomer Hashem el Aaron, where God speaks to Aaron. It's very striking. God speaks to Aaron. Go and greet your Moshe in the desert. And Vayelech vayifkesheu, he goes, he meets him there at the mountain of God. That's where Moshe had the original revelation, the snap, Sinai. And he kisses him. So there's a deep relationship between these 2 brothers. Interesting is that the Torah uses exactly the same word, vayifkesheu, in verse number 27 that it used in verse number 24. In verse 24, vayifkesheu Hashem vayivakesh hamito, right? And now you have once again vayifkesheu bahar Elohim vayishaklo, which might support the Rashbam. Remember, the Rashbam thought that God's anger at Moshe is the fact that Moshe was unwilling to accept his role. And just to refresh our memories, at least the way I presented it, is that when God said to Moshe, go down to Egypt, right? And Moshe says, who am I to go? Who am I to speak to Pharaoh? Who am I to Pharaoh? Who am I to speak to the people? God's answer was, Ki imach. I'm going to be with you. And that's all you have to know. I'm going to be with you. But Moshe doesn't accept that. Moshe is not satisfied with the fact that I will be with you. And Moshe refuses. And Moshe extracts from God 2 different concessions. One is he's going down as a miracle worker. One might say as a kind of Egyptian, one whom the Egyptians will recognize because they're into magic. So he's not going down just with faith and with God alone. He's going down as Moshe the magician. That's a concession God makes. And the second concession is Moshe said to God, I'm not a speaker. We don't talk the same language. I don't speak well. And God's response, as I understood it, was, okay, basically, if I wanted a speaker, I would get a speaker. I don't want a speaker. I want a man of action. But since you insist, and since Moshe is the only candidate for the job, I know your brother Aaron, your dati ki daber hu, he's a good talker, which I read as somewhat of a negative statement. But in any event, and here you have, those are the 2 concessions that Moshe squeezed out of God. God's not in a good negotiating place because God wants Moshe. Moshe is the only candidate. So here we have the 2 vayifkeshus. Maybe they're connected. That the fact that Moshe insists he can't go himself and insists on Aaron, part of God's irritation at Moshe is that Moshe refused to go simply with faith, as God had suggested. Go in faith. Moshe at this point in his career can't do that. So that's the 2 vayifkeshus. In any event, the other point I wanted to emphasize that we've come across is here, you have this connection between the brothers. The book of Bereshit is about animosity between brothers, but in Sefer Shemot, we don't find that. On the contrary, we find his sister watching out for Moshe. We find Moshe's brother coming, greeting him, kissing him, happy to see him. So they're going to work as a team. There's a partnership over here, and we'll come back to this through the course of our study. The partnership of Moshe and Aaron. Let's continue. We'll read a few more verses. Vayagid Moshe v'Aaron, ekol divrei Hashem asher shlocho, v'ekol ha'otot asher tzivos. So Moshe fills Aaron in with everything, all the conversation, the signs that God had commanded him, about which God had commanded him. Vayelech Moshe v'Aaron vayasu et kol ziknei bnei, and Moshe and Aaron gather all the elders. Vayidaber Aaron ekol advarim asher diber Hashem al Moshe. Vayasol tot l'nei ha'am, and Aaron in verse number, not Moshe. Aaron's the spokesperson here. Aaron talks. Aaron tells them everything that God had said to Moshe. He performs the miracles to the people, the staff turning into a snake, the hand becoming leprous and becoming cured, and presumably the third miracle of the blood, throws the blood on the ground, the water, and it turns into blood, etc. By Yamein, and the people believed. By Yishmu ki pakad Hashem et bnei Yisrael b'chirot on Yom vayitu vayishtachavu. People believed. Aaron speaks to them. Aaron talks their language, as God said. He's a good talker. He explains it all, and they believe that God has come to redeem them, that God has seen their suffering, and they bow down. Vayitu vayishtachavu. I presume that is in bowing down. Kido and ishtachavaya is a sign of gratitude. Gratitude. In our prayers, Modim Anach is when you bow down in the Shemona Esrei, you bow down at the beginning when you start, and you bow down at Modim. We are grateful. So in gratitude, so the people believe. That's what it says. By Yamein, Moshe had questioned whether they would believe. It says they do believe. They believe that God has come to redeem them. God has seen their suffering. Okay, now we're going to start a new section. If anybody has any comments, now's the time. Otherwise, we'll begin with chapter 5. Moving right along. Is there anybody, Maxine, or was anything to say here? Or can we just continue?
Neva Hellman had a question from earlier
Go ahead.
about Yehoshua also encounters an angel in chapter 5 of his book,
Yes, he
as
does.
he crossed the Yarden. And there's also a criticism there for neglect of spiritual duties. So
The criticism of neglect of spiritual duties is certainly the Gemara has a criticism of Yehoshua there. Again, I want to get into that, whether it is a critique there or not. But yes, there is that parallel. And in fact, the angel says to Yehoshua, Shalna lecha mi'araglecha, take off your shoes. It's exactly parallel to the language of the sneh. There's a little different. I mean, it's a different mission. The angel that Yehoshua sees, Yehoshua asks this, looks like a person. Who are you? Says Yehoshua. Are you with us or against us? Yeshua's a general. He's the commander-in-chief of the army. Sees the guy staying there. Says, stay where you are. Whose side are you on? Who are you? Identify yourself. So this angel says, Ani sartzva Hashem atabati. I am God's general. I'm God's general. I have come now. In other words, I have come to help you conquer the land. The angel is sartzva Hashem. I have remarked in the past on many occasions the question about prophecy, which is when the prophet has a vision, is that a kind of objective vision that the prophet is seeing? Or is the vision of the prophecy filtered through the prophet himself? In other words, my point is that if you had a vision, if you saw God in your dreams or God's angel in your dream, okay? I presume the angel you might see would not necessarily be an angel, a 5-star general. You know what I mean? That might not be your vision of God's emissary. You might have a different vision. Each of us would have a different vision. When Yehoshua, who's the commander-in-chief of the army, right? He's the Ramatkal. He's the commander-in-chief. When he has a vision about God's angel, it's God's 5-star general. I'm wondering, always wondered about that, to what extent the prophecy is a function of the person, and to what extent it's just someone receiving an objective prophecy. I'm much more inclined to say that, generally speaking, it has to do with the person. When Joseph has dreams, okay, the brothers, whether they think it's prophecy or not, but the brothers presume that his dreams are about Joseph. Prophecy or no prophecy, they presume Joseph's dreams are going to bow down to him because something about Joseph wants them to bow down to him. That's what they're assuming. So anyway, that's very interesting. But yes, the parallel between Moshe and Yoshua, which is one of the dominant themes of the beginning of Sefer Yoshua, that Yoshua is taking over from Moshe. And Yoshua has a different task. Yoshua is a general. He's not Moshe. He's a pupil of Moshe. He wants to preserve the teachings of Moshe. This is always the issue. When someone succeeds someone else, they bring their own being, their own self, their own ideas into the mix. And the question always is, can you maintain, in some sense, the past, some kind of continuity, at the same time deal with problems of the present? That's the Sefer Yoshua is about. That's the challenge. Yoshua is a general. He's not a shepherd. Moshe wanted a shepherd. God says, you want a shepherd? I'll give you Yoshua. You train him to understand something about shepherding, what it means to be a shepherd. But fundamentally, his job is to conquer the land. You need a general for this job, and not a shepherd. So that's really the thing. But the parallels between the two of them and the differences between them, and can you have a successor who's so different from his predecessor? That's really one of the key issues in Sefer Yoshua and question in life in general, in every sphere. When you want to have succession, continuity, how do you maintain the past at the same time deal with the present? And people are different. People are always going to take things a different way. That's the nature of it. That's the nature of our being. So that's the issue in Sefer Yoshua. The parallel is there, but the differences are also there. Sar Tzava Hashem. Moshe didn't see Sar Tzava Hashem. Moshe sees an angel in the snare. Malach Hashem, not God's general. All right, let us continue
Rabbi,
now with
Rabbi,
yes.
one point supporting what you're saying. When Moses is coming down from Har Sinai the first time, and he hears the noise, and he asks Joshua what it is. Joshua, who also hasn't seen it firsthand yet, his response is, "It's a war. Sounds like a war."
Right.
And of course, Moshe goes down and sees, but it supports what you're saying. He sees things through his experience, and he's a general, so he hears war sounds. And
Sure.
sounds of tzchok and idol worship and all this other stuff. But the fact that he, right then, the first thing we hear out of Joshua's mouth is, "I hear, I see, I perceive war." So I think you're right. I think that the quote unquote prophecy that Joshua sees in Malach Hashem is Sar Tzava Hashem, because that's mostly what Joshua needs, and this is his entire ethos.
Yeah.
That's what I think. That it was presaged at the after on the way down from Har Sinai.
Yeah, for sure, 100%. There are other proofs to it as well, but for sure that's right. Okay, let us now begin chapter 5. Okay, Piachar afterwards. Okay, finally, Piachar bo Moshe v'Aaron v'Yamru Paro. So afterwards, Moshe and Aaron come and they speak to Paro. The Chumash, by the way, never tells us a very response to a very simple question. What do you mean they spoke to Paro? How did they get to see Paro? You know, when you want to see somebody of that level, it's not so simple to get an appointment. You know, okay, it's a new pharaoh, but the fact of the matter is, they seem to be able just to walk into his court and to begin a conversation. The Chumash never tells us why. Maybe Moshe is Pharaoh's daughter's child, adopted child. That's one possibility. But again, the Chumash simply passes over this question as to how it could be that Moshe and his confederate, his brother Aaron, are able to speak to Paro. Moshe certainly has no standing with the people. On the contrary, the first time Moshe meets people, they say, who appointed you? Who made you the chief? And yet he can just walk into Paro. So one could claim, if the Chumash doesn't tell us, one could say that maybe the fact that Moshe was Pharaoh's daughter's child gives him entree into the court as a relative, as a kind of grandson of the previous Pharaoh. I don't know, and the Chumash doesn't give us enough information. We can guess at it, but in point of fact, they come to Paro, and they say, Ko amar Hashem Elohei Yisrael, shalach et ami v'yochogu li bamidbar. Well, it's actually very striking that their speech, Moshe and Aaron's speech, begins with the words Ko amar Hashem. Ko amar Hashem, we're very familiar with that expression from the prophetic writings. It appears all over the place in the prophetic writings. Ko amar Hashem, Hashemayim Kiseder. I didn't count up the number of times, one could check it out, but it's quite common. Ko amar Hashem. So here you have them, again, Moshe, God said to Moshe, you will be a godlike figure for Aaron. And Aaron will be your prophet. And here we have them, right, talking in kind of prophetic language. Ko amar Hashem, not only Hashem, Elohei, the God of Israel. Send my people, v'yochogu li bamidbar, let them celebrate a festival in the desert. The understanding, the rabbinic understanding, which could be the simple reading of it, is v'yochogu, a chag. They say festival, but it's a festival in which you bring sacrifices. You want to sacrifice to God. That sounds like it. Even in the Chumash, clearly, what marks a festival in the Torah? What marks a festival in the Torah, first of all, is the prohibition of working. That's one big marker. An Issa Malacha, days you can't work. But the other marker, days in which you bring special sacrifices or additional sacrifices. So V'yochogu can mean to celebrate. It can be to have a festival, but it certainly connects to the bringing of the offering of sacrifices, as we will see. That's clear. They wanted this. So thus says the God of Israel. Vayomeh Paro, mi Hashem asher eshma b'kolo. This Hashem, this name Yud Hey Vav Hey, this Hashem you speak of, the God of Israel. Who is this guy? I never heard of this God. Why should I obey? Asher eshma b'kolo. Lo yadati yes Hashem. I don't know this God, says Paro. V'gamet Yisrael lo ashaleach, and I'm also not going to send Israel. So this is an interesting point. Lo yadati et Hashem. The Midrashim connect us. Not that we need the Midrashim for this, we can do it on our own, but the Midrash, they have the same text we have. That the Lo yadati et Hashem of chapter 5, verse number 2, they connect up to the very beginning of this book. It says, a new Pharaoh emerged in Egypt, Vayokom el Chadash HaMitzrayim, Asher lo yadat Yosef, who didn't know Joseph. The Midrash asked the question, what do you mean the Pharaoh didn't know Joseph? How is that possible? Joseph was the viceroy of Egypt, and not just the viceroy of Egypt, the viceroy who saved the Egyptian people, and not just saved the Egyptian people, he also made Pharaoh a very rich man. He maneuvered all the property and all the cattle and all the money of Egypt into Pharaoh's coffers. What do you mean you don't know? You don't know means you don't want to know. Knowing in this book is not just an intellectual exercise, right? The sister stood from afar with to know what would happen. The idea of knowledge is connectedness, caring and connectedness. Elohim. So the idea of not knowing in the book of Shemot, and maybe in the book of Reshit as well, has to do with not caring. Well, Yadati et Hashem. Did he ever know this thing? Did he not know? He doesn't care to know. That's the point. Well, Yadati et Hashem. And therefore he says, I have no intention of Gamet Yisrael lo Ashaleach. I have no intention of sending out Israel. Fine. So that's the question. The Paro says, I don't know who they are. So in the next pasuk, Moshe and Aaron will explain to Paro exactly who this God is. That's how the Rashbam understands it. I think it's the plain meaning of the text. Vayomru Elohei Ivrim Nikra Aleinu. Let me explain who this God of Israel is. You never heard of the God of Israel. Pharaoh might say, we got a bunch of gods in Egypt, but God of Israel, Hashem, this guy I never heard of. He must not be a local God. I never heard this God. Says Moshe and Aaron say to Paro, no, the God of the Ivrim. And the point is that the Jews in Egypt, the Israelites, are called Ivrim. Joseph was called an Ivri. Ivri means one from the other side. But the point of the Ivri has to do with Aver Hanahar, from the other side of the river. In other words, Aver, one of the descendants of Shem is Aver, right? Shem and Aver. But also Aver, Ivrim, may, as it says in the book of Yoshua, we have it in the Passover Haggadah, may Aver Hanahar Yoshua Votechem Me'olam. Your descendants lived on the other side of the river. So what Moshe says the Rashbam, is, oh, you want to know who the God of Israel is? Of course, you may not know him as the God of Israel, but the fact is, he's Elohei HaIvrim. He's the God of where these people are coming from the old country. He's the God of those who come from the other side. That's the God we're referring to. And this God, Nikra Oleinu, has manifested, has come to us. And therefore, because this God has come to us, please, Neo Chana, Derech Shloshet Yamim Bamidbar, V'nizbechal Hashem Eloheinu, Pen Yifkaenu, Ba'dever O Becharev. So please, now that this is the request, let us take a 3-day journey into the desert, bring sacrifices to our God, for the idea that, now we see that, V'yachogui Bamidbar, to have a festival, has to do with sacrifices, okay? In fact, in the Mishnah, there's a tractate called Masechet Chagiga, talks about the sacrifices that one brings on the festivals, special sacrifice on the festivals, Korban Chagiga, Olad Re'iyah, Korban Chagiga. So that's the request. Let us go for a 3-day journey and bring your sacrifices to our God. Pen Yifkaenu Ba'dever O Becharev. Lest this God, Yifkaenu, he will smite us or harm us with sword, with pestilence, or with sword. I'll get back to that in a second. The first question is, why do they want to go on a 3-day journey? It's not clear from this verse why it requires the 3-day journey to bring sacrifices. Later on, it becomes clear that the request for a 3-day journey is because they can't bring the sacrifices inside Egypt. The Egyptian people will not abide the bringing of sacrifices in Egypt. It's something about the animals that is sacred to them, and that you can't actually slaughter these animals in Egypt. They won't accept it. So therefore, Moshe says, we have to go out to the desert to do this. Let's travel away from Egypt, and we will bring the sacrifices there to our God. And we have to do this, Pen Yifkaenu Ba'dever O Becharev, lest this God smite us with pestilence or sword. Now the question is, what does Pen Yifkaenu mean? Lest he smite us, right? Strike us. They translate, lest God strike us with pestilence or sword. So there are 3 possibilities. Could mean us. Do us a favor. If we don't bring sacrifices to our God will be angry with us, and our lives will be in danger. That's one possibility. The Ramban suggests smite us is not just us, Jews, but all of us. That if we don't bring the sacrifices, we're all of us in danger, we and including you. It's dangerous for all of us. And the third possibility is that the us is you. They don't want to say you. Well, the Gemara calls Lashon Sagi Nahar. But Yifkaenu means Yifkacha. You better let us do it, because if you don't do it, you may be smitten with pestilence or with sword. And let me ask you a question.
Rabbi Silber. So he's
Yes.
talking to Paro saying all this. So he's throwing out a name of one of the 10 Makot. Like, you still haven't been affected strongly enough to realize we need to go,
Well, you're on the right track, but let me help you a bit. You're on the right track. I was about to ask the question, where do we have this in the Passover Haggadah? Actually, in the Haggadah, I believe the Haggadah, without quoting the verse, makes a reference to this pasuk. Remember, in the Haggadah, they speak about the 10 plagues, right? There are 10 plagues. And try to remember this now. B'yad chazaka u'v'zroa netuyu u'v'mora gado. B'yad chazaka, b'yad chazaka ze hadever. Zroa netuya ze acheref. B'yad chazaka ze hadever. K'moshe ne'emar. Hine yad Hashem hoya b'miknacha. Said it. Dever kaved ma'od. U'v'zroa netuya ze acheref. Shenemar charbosh shlufa biyado netuya al Yerushalayim. So the point of the drasha in the Haggadah, Yad Chazaka and Zroa Netuya, that Yad Chazaka is Dever, and Zroa Netuya is Cherev. And of course, the point of the Haggadah, the drasha in the Haggadah, which fits in beautifully with this pasuk, doesn't say it, but this is what they're getting at, I believe. What do you mean by dever or b'cherev? How does that go understand dever and cherev? Rosie was on the right track here. The point is, what number plague is dever? What number plague is dever?
Kinim Arav Dever. 5. Number 5.
Dever is 5. And cherev, which is makat b'chorot, is 10. So it's the first 5 and the last 5. In other words, the point of dever and cherev, the Haggadah, the drushes on the plagues, they're very interesting. They divide the plagues in different ways. The Haggadah divides the plagues in 3 different ways. It's all in my Passover Haggadah. I talk about it. The point is, one is we know 3, 3, 3, and 1. I'm not going to get into it. We'll see later on when we get to the plagues. One way is to divide them 2, 2, 2, 2, and 2, 5 twos. But the other way is to divide them 5 and 5. The 5th one, the Deber, which is the culminating plague of the first 5, that's the death of the animals. That's Dever. And the Cherev, which is the culminating plague of the last 5, is Cherev, which is the death of the people. So what the Haggadah understands is basically, Pen Yifkaenu Badever or Bacherev, that Moshe doesn't want to say to Paro, it's not polite, He says, God may smite us with Dever and Cherev. But in point of fact, what Moshe is alluding to is, I know you don't care if God smites us, but let me tell you a little secret. Either it's not going to be only us, or it won't be us at all. It'll be you. So we're giving you a warning. Now remember, when Moshe was told by God when he goes down to Egypt, remember God said to Moshe, Israel is my firstborn son, and say to Paro, if you don't let them go, I'm going to kill your firstborn son, right? Now Moshe does say that later, but over here it's actually hinted at even before they have the plagues. That's the point. Now, by the way, in the beginning, when God told Moshe what to say, if you recall, God had said to Moshe, tell him this verse, that the God of the Hebrews has chanced upon you. When Moshe first speaks, though, with Aaron, he says, oh, hey, Israel. So he actually deviated to some extent because from Pharaoh's perspective, Israel sounds like you have your own identity. Ivri is not your own identity. Ivri is the way I see the other. So Moshe explains, we are the Ivrim, but the Ivrim has a double meaning over here. Yes, it's not the God in this particular locale. Our God is not the God of this locale. We have a God of our ancient God, from the other place, from the other side. That's the God that has come to us. So there's a kind of veiled thread over here, maybe not that veiled. Now we have Paro's response. Vayomer Paro, Vayomer Aleichem Melech Mitzrayim. Lama Moshe v'Aaron tafriu et ha'am mimasav l'chul l'sivlotechem. So now the question is, so here the translation is that the king of Egypt said to them, Moshe and Aaron, why would you tafriu? Tafriu can be to disturb. Here they translate tafriu as to distract. The commentaries have a question: is distracting? Is it disturbing? Right? Get to your labors. Get to your labors can mean you, Moshe and Aaron, you do what you got to do. Get out, leave. Or get to your labors could be Moshe and Aaron as representing the people. Get back to work. Stop with this silly talk about vacations. 3-day journey to a desert means you lose a whole week. You're 3 days there, 3 days back. You're losing a week. We can't afford this. But also there's something else about this word which is very important, which the translation never picks up. That's the problem with translations. They can't pick this up. But there's something else. Whether you translate distract or disturb, there's something else in the verse that no translator could pick up. And that is the word tafriyu. Because the word tafriyu is a play, and not the only play, on the word paro. What Paro is really saying to them is, yes, distracting, disturbing. Says, listen, let's get this straight. There's one pharaoh in this land who makes all the rules. You're coming to me, you want to change the rules. You want to give them a vacation. You want to serve your God. No. You are not Paro. Lama Moshe v'Aaron tafriya. You're going to tell them what to do? There's one Pharaoh here, and you're talking to him. So therefore, leave. You go. Your job is to work. Your job is to suffer. My job is to make the rules and to oppress. I'm Paro, and you're not Paro. Here you have a beautiful example of why the translations are important, but they can never fully capture it. And you have it later on in Sefer Shemot. You have it later on in Sefer Shemot. Once again, the book plays with the name Paro. Of course, that's the story of the golden calf. Moshe comes down the mountain. He has left Aaron and Hur in charge. And the people came to Aaron and they said, make us a god who walks before us. And Aaron agrees. Okay, we'll get to that someday maybe. He tries to delay them. He tries to whatever. But he agrees. He makes them a golden calf. And Moshe comes down the mountain. And Moshe sees what's going on. And Moshe breaks the tablets. Sees, Vayam Moshe et ha'am ki faruahu. He saw the people were porua. They had lost discipline. They were undisciplined. The word porua, the hair which grows wild.
Yes, wild.
Not disciplined. And the Chumash continued there in chapter 32. Kifra'o Aaron, Lushim Saba Kamahem, for Aaron had Pra'o Aaron. And Pra'o Aaron, right? Pro is Para'oto. For Aaron had made them wild. But what's interesting
Also
over there,
with the hair,
yes,
it's Isha Para at Rosha.
it's written with the archaic K. The archaic, the way it's normally written, Pro, Pei Reish Aleph Vav, Para'oto. But in the archaic spelling, it's a hey instead of a vav. The Chumash has left it in the hey, and it's not a mistake. It's clearly that the Chumash intends it to be read Pra'o, of course, but it wants to have the word Pei Reish Ayin, which spells Paro.
Rabbi
Pra'o Aharon, for Aaron had made them wild, and which means for Aaron, acting like he's Paro, had made them wild, as a disgrace before their enemies. There you have another example of how the Torah plays, not just with the meaning of the word, but with the letters. You have
When a woman,
in chapter 32,
Rabbi
and
Silber,
over here. Yeah,
Rabbi Silber,
Quiet.
when a woman is throwing off her hair,
yes.
Isha Para Rosha is
Ufarad Rosh Haisha and Sota. Ufarad Rosh Haisha.
right.
Rabbi, could you repeat?
One second.
Grows wild.
Second. Yeah.
No, I didn't hear. I don't know if everyone else heard it. You were saying something amazing. You said the Chumash spells it with a hey, and we see that Aaron acted like Pharaoh. Could you expand that?
Yes, the making of the golden calf is a reversion to Mitzrayim. You make a golden calf, and it's made from the gold they took out of Egypt. If you take the book of Exodus has two parts. It's very simple. The first half is the Exodus from Egypt. The second half is the spiritual Exodus from Egypt. And if you make a golden calf, after you've heard, I am the God who took you out of Egypt, 10 commandments, and before Moshe comes down the mountain to give them the tablets, they have they say about this golden calf, these are the gods who took you out of Egypt. What that means is that from a spiritual standpoint, you never left. So that the one who makes the golden calf essentially is making it very clear through his action, through his enabling them to worship a golden calf made out of the gold of Egypt, that from a spiritual standpoint, they still are there. And in fact, it's very striking. How does Aaron make the golden calf? When you look at the story of the golden calf, you have what Aaron says, and you have what Aaron did. What Aaron said, Moshe says to Aaron, it's a very important interchange. Let me just take a look for a second. Let me find that for a second, since I mentioned it. So it's a digression, but it's an important digression. It's in chapter 32. So Moshe comes down the mountain. Let's find this over here. Chapter 32, verse number 24. What did this people do to you? He brought upon them a great sin. Aaron says, don't be angry, my Lord. You know the people. Kibarao. They're in a bad way. They say, make us a God who will go before us. Moshe's God. I said, who has gold? verse number 20. No, this is verse 24. I'm sorry, this is 24. I said, who has gold? Hit Baraku, they took the gold off. They gave it to me. I threw it into the fire, and this golden calf came out. That's what Aaron says. When you read that verse, sounds like he says, look, they gave me all this gold. I threw it into the fire, and somehow, don't ask me how, it turned out to be a golden calf. That's Aaron's explanation, okay? In other words, listen, you know the way the people are. I didn't want to do this. They came to me, and I said, okay, whoever has gold, throw it to the fire, and this came out. And the next verse says, Vayar Moshe Adam Kifar Ruahu. Most of the people were wild, out of control. Kifir Aro with the hay, for Aaron had made them wild as a menace to any who would oppose them, right? Shimsa, or disgrace, I would say, more than menace, to those who oppose them. That's what Aaron says he did. But what did Aaron actually do? Let's find what Aaron did. What Aaron did, let's find over here. That's earlier in the chapter. Let's see. Verse number 4, chapter 32, verse 4. Aaron said, take the gold of the women, the children, bring it to me. They did it. Right? He commands them, take for the women and the children. Verse number 3, they took off all the people took off the earrings, right? They brought it to Aaron. Verse number 4, Aaron took the gold. He cast it, they translate, he cast it in a mold, right? The better translation's on the bottom. He fashioned it with a graving tool. A cheret's a graving tool. And he made it into a calf. And they said, these are your gods who took you out of Egypt. So how do you reconcile, actually, not to go into that story, but since I mentioned this and everything's connected, the Torah makes it about as clear as a bell, can't be more clear, that Aaron takes the gold and he fashions it, by Yatzar Oto Bacheret, he sculpts it out and he turns it into a golden calf. Well, Moshe says, what happened over here? I took the gold, I threw it into the fire, and this golden calf came out. We say to ourselves, that doesn't sound like the same story. Now, while we're studying the story of the golden calf, we spent a fair amount of time on this. Let me make a simple point about what Aaron actually did as the Torah describes it. Probably is an engraving tool. But we can't avoid the obvious connection between the word cheret, which is a rare word in the Torah. There's only one other place, as far as I know, and that is the word chartumim. The chartumim are the magicians of Pharaoh. So here you have Aaron making it bacheret, and the Torah says pro Aaron pei resh ayin hey, which means in short, what it means is if you make a golden calf, you're still in Egypt. You may be physically out of Egypt, but you are spiritually in the land of Egypt. Now, what did Aaron mean when he said, I threw it to the fire and this came out? How could we explain this short of saying he's just making excuses, not taking responsibility? But there is a way to explain it, actually. I mean, it's still evasion of responsibility, I think, but he's making an important point about the golden calf. Then we'll get back to our chapter, which is what Aaron says is, listen, I did this thing. I had no idea when we started this golden calf business how this would turn out, which is true. In other words, the point of the story of the ego is that he makes a golden calf and the people get very, very connected to the golden calf. People love the golden calf. Come back tomorrow. I will serve God tomorrow. They're up 4 o'clock in the morning. They're dancing their way to shul. You know what I mean? We don't see that typically. And they bring sacrifices and they get up. Moshe comes down the mountain and what does he see? Not just the golden calf, the worship of the golden calf. That he knew about. Didn't know about the dancing and the singing. That's what makes him angry. It's the enthusiasm. So what Aaron says is actually true in a sense. He says, listen, I had no idea what's going to happen. They said, make this thing. I made it. Tried to delay them. And things got out of control, which is very, very true. And that's part of Pro-Aharon as well. That's part of being Porua, being out of control. The golden calf touched a nerve. It touched something which is real. Not this abstract God, you know. Here they have a calf. They can feel it. They can see it. They can dance around it. People need something concrete. Anyway, let's get back to our chapter now. We're back in chapter 5. Fine. Now let's get to verse number 5. Chapter 5, verse 5. Let me take a couple more verses, and I'll stop for comments and questions. Vayomer Paro, very important verse. Hein rabim ata am haaretz, vishbatem otam misiv otam. Now Pharaoh turns to Moshe and says, Moshe and Aaron says, listen, there's so many people. That's how the book begins. The Israelites have multiplied. There's so many of them. You would have them cease from their labors. In other words, I can't afford this kind of thing. I got 1 million workers here. What, you want a week vacation? Who's going to build the store cities? I mean, all this important work. Therefore, that makes no sense. Therefore, they can't cease from the labors. And the word to underline over here is the word v'hishbatem. You will cause them to cease. Shin bet taf, Shabbat. You would give them a Sabbath. You would give them a Shabbat. How's that possible? There's so many of them. When you work for Pharaoh, there's no Shabbos. And there's no Shabbos. And there's certainly no week of celebration of service to God. You can forget about that. That's not going to happen. I mention this as being very significant because the book of Exodus and the end of the book of Exodus, we just finished we just read Parsha Pekudei. We finished Exodus. The book begins and ends with the same thing. It begins with building and it ends with building. It begins with building for Pharaoh and it ends with building the Mishkan. There's a big difference between building for Pharaoh and the Mishkan. When you build for Pharaoh, there's no Shabbos. That's what he says. We can't afford a Shabbos. You would cease them to work, forget about that. When you build the Mishkan, the big emphasis in the Mishkan is Shabbat. Shabbat is mentioned before the instructions. Shabbat is mentioned before the building. You don't work on Shabbat. The Mishkan is about sacred space, and Shabbat is about sacred time, and the two, each one has to respect the other. That's the difference. One of the differences between working for Paro and working for God. We'll come back to this very central point of the book. And now we have Paro's commands. Let me just take a couple more verses. Okay, so Pharaoh commanded, now there are two different groups. There are Noksim, here they translate taskmasters, and they are Shotrim, here they translate overseers. Now the command is the next verse. Let me just take a couple more minutes on this and we'll have to stop it. Lo tosifun watei temen la'am lupon avenim kitmol shalom. Hem yochu because shula hem teven. You have to scroll down a little. Don't give them any straw. For making bricks. In order to make the bricks, they need straw. Don't give them the straw. However, matkonet alvenim means the amount of bricks. Asher hem osim tmol shalom tosimu alihem. Or tigru mimenu. They have to produce the same amount of bricks. Kinepimem, they're lazy. Alkenim tzoakim leimar nechad is b'chal Hashem. Tichbado avodah on Hashem v'yasu ba. V'yal yeshu b'divrei shaka. We'll get back to that verse next time we meet. In other words, they're lazy. And therefore, I have a new set of orders Paro gives. Stop with the straw. Don't give them straw to make the bricks. Let them get their own straw. But they have to make the same number of bricks. This is the command he gives to the Noksim and the Shotrim. Let me just make one comment over here, and then we'll take comments and questions. We'll have to stop. Next week is Purim. There's no class. We meet in 2 weeks. Pharaoh in response to Moshe and Aaron's request to allow them to serve God, he rejects that completely. I don't know from his God, and I'm Pharaoh, not you. So a new demand. I'll make it worse for them because obviously lazy, don't want to work. Same number of bricks without the straw. This is a very, very important and very telling command by Paro for the following reason. If I were Paro, I'm not Paro. If I were Paro, I would have said the following thing. How many bricks you guys make in an hour? 15 bricks an hour? Okay. From now on, 20 bricks an hour. You make 20 bricks. Work harder. Produce more bricks. We'll build more store cities this way. That's what I would have said. But that's not what Paro says. What Paro says is we're not giving you straw. You got to find your own straw. How do you find your own straw? So it says in the psukim that follow, they would scatter about throughout the land to find the straw. But finding the straw takes time. So they come back, they have the straw, but they can't produce the number of bricks. So instead of getting the same number of bricks, they are producing fewer bricks. That's what happens in the story. And the taskmasters, turns out to be Jews in charge of the work, they're beaten. They get beaten because the people can't produce the number. Matkone talavenim. And from this, we can infer one very important point about Paro and about the work. And it's a very simple point. Paro actually doesn't care about the work. That is to say, you're making the bricks to build store cities. Paro doesn't care about the store cities. The goal is not to build the store cities. The goal is to make people suffer with the work. Because if the goal were the store cities, you would have them produce more bricks, not fewer bricks. They can't produce the number of bricks, which means that you're working for Paro. What's so terrible about this work over here? Yes, there's no stoppage, there's no Shabbos. That's terrible. It's terrible for other reasons as well, which we'll discuss another time. But the point is, you're working for someone who doesn't care about your work. The work you are doing has no purpose to it, because he doesn't care about the cities. If he cared about the store cities, there'd be more bricks. The work is there to break you down. And that's the frustration. It's exactly the opposite of the Mishkan. The two key words in the Mishkan, which the Gemara picks up and runs with to the end of the earth, which define work on Shabbos. Two words, Melechet Machshevet, thoughtful labor, purposeful labor. That's the definition of Shabbat Melacha, Melechet Machshevet. It's exactly the opposite. This guy couldn't care less. You're producing 7 bricks, not 15. He doesn't care. Produce 1 brick, but he makes them work harder. As he says, let the labor be more harsh. Let them not be swayed by talk. Next time we'll talk about what Al Yeshuba Divrei Shakar means. This is a very important point about the avoda, the avdus of Mitzrayim. It's work that has no purpose at all. Zero. Couldn't care less about it. Now, let me stop here at this point. A couple of announcements to make. I'll take the questions. Turns out today I'm actually giving another shiur, a brief shiur. Teresha's partnering with something called Torah in Motion. And I'm giving a shiur for 33-minute shiur, starting at 10 to 12, about the Megillah. Searching for God in Megillat Esther, part of a day-long program they have, and Drisha partnered with them in terms of my shiur. Okay, want to mention that. Are there any questions or comments about what we've studied today?
Yeah, just a quick hi, Rabbi.
Hi.
Comment on you said that Moshe and Aaron just seem to just get their just a whisk in the palace, and I think that the assumption that they are known quantities makes sense, because Pharaoh doesn't ask, "Who are you?" He asks, "Who's that God of yours?" And he doesn't. He there is no, or at least it's not mentioned in the text. We don't have a question about who. What are you doing in front of me? I don't know who you are. So I think that's
clear. My question is why. No, for sure. He did clearly. I was just wondering how that could be. So yeah, I suggest maybe because it's Pharaoh's daughter's child. That's why.
Yeah. Yes.
But I agree. He doesn't ask why. He says, "What do you want?"
And it's
say, present your credentials. See,
Yeah, and no
And
credentials.
they have no credentials, actually. Now, they do come with the elders,
Yes,
although the Medrash claims the elders all backed out. Doesn't mention the elders. But if the elders are all there with them and they spokespeople, that would explain it. If they come with the Zakanim, Pharaoh knows the Zakanim. So that makes sense. But the Medrash, of course, since it doesn't mention the Zakanim, the famous Medrash says that they start off with the 70 elders. By the time they got there and turned around, there was nobody there. They
it's
all
like,
sort of chickened out on the way there. But anyway, that's the Medrash.
and
But if the
also,
elders are there, it explains. That's a good point. Yeah.
and also the fact that Moses and Aaron are speaking in one voice. That's an interesting thing that they're speaking together.
Right.
And you know, as God had told Moses it would happen, and it doesn't happen later, right? They don't speak together, but
Right.
they speak in one voice.
Right. No, for sure. 100%. I think as you raised the question, I think that if the elders are there, it would explain better. Because the elders, he knows. And why we know Moshe and Aaron? Moshe and Aaron don't represent anybody. All right, let me stop you there at this point.
Rabbi
Okay.
Silber, Rabbi
Yes,
Silber,
yes,
why do they use a word like Isha Para Rosha, like as if she's wildly uncovering her head, you know? I mean, it's the
right.
same.
But she's acting in a way that's not disciplined. That's the point. So
Right.
So the idea of the wild hair, women in those days will cover their hair, but the fact is, the hair being wild or uncontrolled or undisciplined relates to the behavior, which is an undisciplined behavior.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll stop you at this point. Maxine, you have any announcements?
Okay, well, this week, Thursday, after breaking fast, Rabbi Silber will be giving a special shiur for Purim, titled "For a Time Like This," and it'll be reflections on celebrating Purim after October 7th. That's this Thursday at 8:30 p.m. Hoping to see you there. And yeah, then we will have a break for Purim, as was mentioned before, and we'll be meeting again for this shiur the week after. So yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So
Is
Dara,
there Mishnah today? Is there Mishnah
Yes, there
today?
is. Yes. Regular classes, 3 o'clock, right. I'm giving this other thing and then Mishnah at 1 o'clock. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay then.